It's very good to welcome Mr. John Gummer, MP, to open our course on science, faith and society. Mr. Gummer was educated at Cambridge, so it's welcoming him back home, one might say. He read history at Selwyn College. And he's had a very distinguished career in politics. He's one of only 5 people in the last 200 years to be a government minister for 16 years or more. He's held very significant posts, particularly as Agriculture Minister and as Environment Secretary. And he's played a key role in environmental work internationally as a government minister. He was involved in the Convention on Climate Change meetings in Berlin and Geneva. The Secretary General of the United Nations named him as one of a small committee of distinguished persons advising on habitat. He was elected chairman of the Environmental Committee of the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development by his fellow ministers. Friends of the Earth called him the best environment secretary they've ever had. So he is very distinguished. He's also received a medal from the Royal Society for the Protection of Birds. He is a very busy constituency MP, and in addition he writes regularly for the Catholic Herald and various other magazines, often with a focus on environment but also other social issues to do with politics and religion. So it's a great pleasure to welcome you this evening, John, to speak to us. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Now, of course, I really couldn't finish what I have to say with one word, because I've been asked to discuss the title, How Does Parliament Handle the Ethical Controversies Raised by Scientific Advance? And the answer is, and could remain, badly. That, I'm afraid, is the most important message which I may have to give this evening. But it does seem to me that it is a fascinating part of looking at the way in which societies handle big issues to try to unpick what we instinctively, and I think rightly, would believe about the way we do it. Why is it that we do it badly, and what does that tell us about our attitudes to the great issues? And perhaps to get behind that, and particularly because there is a number of people here who come from other countries and who perhaps are less familiar with the way in which the British Parliament operates. And even those from our own country, very often when one discusses it too closely, discover they're pretty unfamiliar with the way the British Parliament operates. So if you'll excuse me, I want to try to look at some of the particularities about the British Parliament, which bears on the problem of how you deal with great ethical issues, and particularly those which are raised by scientific advance. The parliamentary system is not like any other system. It isn't affected in the same way as the United States by a division of powers, nor has it come as a kind of advisory situation which most continental systems have. It is in fact, and always has been, based upon the principle that you have a government which sits in Parliament and an opposition which is the government in waiting. And there is an official position for both sides in that sense. And indeed, the history of why we are like that is itself very interesting in this context. Historically, of course, when the king, or as it actually happened to be the Queen, Elizabeth I, called together representatives from her great cities and counties round the country, they came to the Palace of Westminster, which was and is a royal palace, and there was nowhere for them to sit. Like most organisations, they hadn't thought about that in advance. So they sat in the only place which was satisfactory, and that was the chapel. So they sat facing each other, as any of the college chapels that you will see are designed. Both be designed, of course, for the alternate singing of psalms and of religious music. And over the years what happened was that this advisory council, which had very little power, gradually gained power, and the two sides became clear. One was the side which generally supported the government, the king, and the other was the side that generally didn't support the government and usually supported the king's son, for he, in most cases, was busy stirring a bit up before the opportunity came for him to rule himself. So it was natural that they faced each other in this way, and it was natural too that the great leaders in each side began to be, obviously, both spokesmen and the sense of the government spokesman and the opposition. And it grew. And the reason why I want to tell that story is that it's crucially important to see that the British Houses of Parliament have grown. It's an evolutionary process, with the single exception of the regrettable revolution during the period of Oliver Cromwell. The British House of Commons has had an uninterrupted growth from before Queen Elizabeth, although it's difficult really to tie that into this continuum. But certainly, apart from Oliver Cromwell, uninterrupted right up to the present day. And it has therefore suffered from neither of the things that continental legislatures have. There is no other country in Europe which has not had its parliamentary advance interrupted by war or by revolution. France, after all, has the Fifth Republic. Since 1789, we've had the revolutionary governments, we've had the Napoleonic government, we had the return of the Bourbons, we had the Orleanists, we then had the second Napoleonic government, and then we had the Third Republic, and then we had the Fourth Republic, and now we've had the Fifth Republic, and of course in the meantime they were occupied by the Germans and had a puppet regime in Vichy. So it's not surprising that the institution of Parliament, as far as the French are concerned, and I've only taken them as an example because others are even more fragmented and historically broken, that the institution of Parliament is a much more artificial one. It's rewritten and reproduced by a logical process, very often in a matter of decade. Very difficult for the British to understand, I think, the degree to which the French still feel that their constitutional structure is fragile, because after all it was as recently as 1956 in the Événement de Mai when the government was changed by force of people on the streets. It isn't actually easy to have the absolute confidence in the continuity of a political establishment if that political establishment is as recent as almost every other European country. Leave alone those now happily members of the European Union who until only a decade ago or more were still communist totalitarian states. And if you look at the membership of the European Union generally, Spain and Portugal and Greece, both, all of them, with recent fascist dictatorship history, countries elsewhere who more recently have had alien authorities, and even to look at Germany or Italy, countries which were not countries until, after all, 1870. So there is something peculiar about the British House of Parliament. And that peculiarity lies in its evolutionary nature. But of course that means that it isn't terribly good at handling new things, because it takes time to change in order to do that. So at its heart is the nature, at its heart of its nature, is its the difficulty of handling the kind of controversy which doesn't fit the concept of a government and a government in waiting. And it is a very important understanding that we are exploring now, because it starts to highlight some of the fundamental issues which will follow when you come to discuss Sir John Horton's talk on global warming and society's response. And I want to use global warming as one of those things which, where scientific advance raises what I believe to be ethical controversies in the context of a parliament unfitted to handle it. So if the first problem is that this is a parliament which evolves and therefore finds it difficult to change rapidly enough to handle big issues that don't fit its pattern, its second problem is that it shares with many other parliaments the disadvantage of democracy, which is that you don't have very long periods in which to make decisions. We have an election by law 5 years after the last election date. In fact, it is usually 4 years. Government goes for its full run only if it knows it's going to lose. If it thinks it's going to win, it chooses the moment in which it is most likely to wrong foot its opposition. And we have, again, an unusual, I think probably unique situation, which is that the date of the election is chosen by the sitting government, and all it needs to do is to give 3 weeks' notice. In effect, it has to give 5 weeks' notice because the system doesn't work more quickly than that. So we have the second issue, which is that this is not only a parliament, but an institutional structure ill-fitted to handle long-lasting issues. It can only work in short bursts. Now, that, of course, it has in common with all parliaments, but it particularly affects Britain because the government is in Parliament. And that's the third reason why I think one has to see the difficulty that arises. If you take the American system or the French system, ministers attend Parliament in the French system. They don't even attend Parliament in the American system, but ministers are outside Parliament. They don't need to be members of Parliament. They can be chosen by the President or Prime Minister, depending what the system is, and they are then serving him, or they serve a prime ministerial structure, but they appear in Parliament. They may have to give account of themselves in most European assemblies, but in the end they do not arise from Parliament. The parliamentary system in Britain demands that ministers are themselves members of Parliament, either in the main members of the House of Commons, elected members, or to some extent the members of the House of Lords, unelected members, but in the Senate. But it's a necessary part of it. And that means, of course, that the people who are driving the system are themselves part of the system. They are not apart from it. And their existence is tied in very tightly to that 4 or 5 year period. And their attitudes are the attitudes formed by having worked their way through the parliamentary system before they become ministers. So they are imbued with that system of the sitting government facing the government in waiting. They are imbued with a system that looks at life in 5-year tranches at most. They come from an institution, and their success and their appointment depends upon the way they have handled that institution. Now, if you take the United States, that's not true at all. A president will choose a Secretary of State. He may have been, for example, like a recent appointment, he may well have been the head of Goldman Sachs, and he will then enter the job of being a minister, bringing with him a wholly different history from the way in which the British minister will operate. So, the first point I want to make is that we are, to a real extent, prisoners of a structure. Now, that may be, in many ways, a good thing. I'm not suggesting it automatically is a bad one, and by using the word prisoner, perhaps I give that impression. It just merely is that it is a thing. It's true. And therefore, it makes it very difficult for those who are involved in that structure to deal with big issues which don't naturally lend themselves to the way the structure has built for its solution of problems. There isn't a ministry of scientific controversy. There isn't an organisation which handles long-term structural issues raised by science. There isn't a way in which you can decide on matters which can only be solved over a very long period. So I come back to the question of climate change. Parliament in this country has had a bipartisan policy towards the environment in general and climate change in particular. Its mechanism of solving these big problems is to say that for this issue we will suspend the concept of a government and a government in waiting, and we will try to come to a kind of consensus, very often not one which is worked out terribly methodically, but it is one which is assumed or accepted. And that normally arises because the public out there expects it. Or, to be really cynical, it arises when no political party thinks there are any votes in the issue which is being discussed, and there are only votes to be lost. Therefore, it is better to have a consensus, because then you cannot be said to be the ones who are making the nuisance of themselves. So that is very often why the consensus arises. And of course it is notable that the consensus on the environment has been largely damaging over these past 10 years, if not longer. The policy towards the environment of the present government is almost precisely that which they inherited from the previous government. And as that was my policy, I think I can reasonably judge them on that. When I was the Secretary of State for the Environment for 4 years, there was no real consensus because only the government was very interested in these things. It was one of the difficulties that I found. Because if in the system which is designed for controversy, i.e. that one side keeps the government in power and the other side keeps the government down to it because it wants power, if you take that controversial bit out, then the difficulty is that there is no real pressure upon the government to move faster, further, or more excitingly or innovatively. And apart from the occasional row over some peripheral matter, my opposite number was a man called Dobson, a senior figure in the Labour Party who became, in the Labour government, the Minister of Health. I have to say he was not interested in the environment, and the people who drove and dictated the system, i.e. people who did the public opinion polling, Mr. Mandelson and his friends, did not until very late on in the Parliament believe that the environment was a matter of any interest to the public at all, and that there were any votes in it whatsoever. So we had a Parliament which was not driving the issue at all. The issue was driven by the minister, who happened to believe in it, and a very fine collection of civil servants who were similarly engaged. And I have to say that if it were not for the attentions of Greenpeace, we wouldn't have moved at all. The great advantage of the NGOs was that they were setting an agenda far beyond that of Parliament, and it did enable one to show that we had to move significantly faster. I was, of course, hugely the beneficiary of the fact that Mrs. Thatcher, because she was a scientist, had been an early convert to the concept of climate change. And I remember when I was the Deputy Minister of Agriculture, which happened to have responsibility, for reasons I've never quite understood, for sea defences. I was the Minister for Sea Defences, and I had to make a decision about the terms and parameters under which we would, in fact, in future construct those defences. And I remember the civil servants coming in and giving me all the details and the amounts of money we had and the heights and the sea rises expected and the rest of it. And then one of them said, well, of course, I think we are duty bound to say to Minister that there is a small reasonably respectable group who suggest that there is such a thing as global warming back in the 80s. And they think that we will have much increased sea levels. And they believe that we have to take account of pretty soon sea level rises of 6 or 8 centimetres. And if you take their view, of course, we would have to have wholly different rules about the levels and the standards to which our sea defences should adhere. Well, I said I happen to be one of those small group of people who also believe in global warming. I think it's pretty difficult not to do so, and in any case, I think it's a matter of prudence. It is a sensible thing to do. Well, I said, I'm afraid that even if you do decide to do it, it won't happen, because the Treasury doesn't believe in global warming, and therefore it won't happen. I said, of course the Treasury doesn't believe in global warming, it doesn't believe in anything that costs money. But I used to write Mrs. Thatcher's speeches, and therefore had an opportunity to speak to her directly in a way which most junior ministers in my position wouldn't have had, so I rang her up. And I said, Prime Minister, this is the situation. I explained the situation, and I said the Treasury is going to say no, but I do believe that this is a matter of really serious decision making. And she, from the other end of the phone, said, John, there are 2 people in our government which believe in climate change. You and me. That means we're a majority. And as a result, the sea defences of Britain are built to a level significantly better than anybody else's in Europe. But that didn't have anything to do with Parliament making a decision. That had to do with individuals finding ways of delivering what they believed to be right in areas where Parliament was not actually sovereign, because this is an area where the delegated power is in the hands of ministers. And the problem that has happened since then is that where there is no real parliamentary pressure, either because people don't think it's important, which was true between 1993 and 1997, or because there is a tacit understanding between the government and opposition that we're all on the side of the environment, and therefore we won't make it a party political argument, it enables people to say the right things but does not press them to do anything about it. Now, of course, that is made the more difficult if you have institutionally the problem which all parties have, and I'm trying to make this as objective as possible, but this government's had particularly, which is that it is much easier to say than to do, and the connection between saying and doing is quite hard to achieve. Now, people often talk about joined-up government. It's joined-down government that's very difficult. It's actually getting what you have decided you want to do done, because there are all sorts of barriers between the two, and it is that which has particularly bedeviled dealing with these ethical controversies, particularly those relating to climate change, over this past period. What the government has been able to do is to assert its belief in climate change, to start with, in advance of public opinion, but not to have to do any of the things that would be politically embarrassing as a result of that assertion. Now, that doesn't mean to say it hasn't been very helpful, because it does mean that we've now reached a point at which, at least politically, the major parties, given a few of the usual suspects who never agree with anything, however obvious, the major political parties are committed to a view that climate change is occurring, that human beings are the major reason for its occurrence, and that we have to do something about it, and do something about it rapidly. That's about where it finishes. And so what is happening in Parliament now is a realisation that if you are going to make the changes which you need to make because of scientific advance, then those changes have got to be made by the usual methods. In other words, you've got to make the system, which is a system of controversy, work in order to deliver what we're thinking about. So, if you can't achieve it by a bipartisan policy, you have to achieve it by a competitive policy. Now, it is in that sense bipartisan because it means that both sides are in general seeking to win the same argument, to achieve the same ends, and the competition is about how far and how fast and what way. So, those of you who have been listening on the radio or watching the television will have seen that there's an interesting discussion arising. So Menzies Campbell explaining that he's more Green than Mr. Cameron. The Green Party saying that it's everybody who says they're Green and are not members of the Green Party are frauds, and that the real party should stick forward the Greens, even though they can't be elected. But still, and no doubt we will have the Labour Party explaining how green it is at the Labour Party conference, and I can tell you for sure the Conservatives are certainly going to show how green they are. Now that means that what we have actually done is to turn into an institutional possibility the demands which are laid upon us by the scientific advance. Now I want at this point to make a serious issue about the different kinds of scientific advance. And perhaps therefore to explain why the way Parliament's going to have to handle the issue of climate change is going to be unique and very different from anything we've ever seen before. I do believe that we are passing through the most exciting revolutionary period that has happened since the Renaissance. I think that climate change is much more fundamental than the mere but frightening fear that the planet might come to an end because of mankind's behaviour. That itself is big enough. But I want to suggest to you that what science has done in coming to this bit of advance does begin to challenge the way human beings operate much more fundamentally than any change since Galileo. First of all, it's about knowledge. And the older I get, the more that I am enamoured of the book of Genesis. Because the more that I understand that myth though it may be, truth it certainly is. That deep in that whole story is an attempt to express the human dilemma, which is very fundamental to any understanding of science, indeed any understanding of politics. Because the issue that is so important is, first, that knowledge cannot be unknown. Having got it, the one thing you can't do is to pretend you haven't got it. It's a message that Islam might well take to heart. It is a crucial message about life. Dictators spend a lot of time trying to overcome this problem, and indeed it is arguable that the fall of dictators is normally because the knowledge that is there, they have failed to stop their population getting hold of. So knowledge cannot be unknown. But the second truth about this is that if you think about other myths, the myths as portrayed in fairy stories, one of the favourite issues is knowing the future. The wish, if only I knew the future. Mirror, mirror on the wall, who's the fairest of them all? I want to know about things I shouldn't know about. And of course, the story always says that if you know the future, you are much worse off than if you didn't. That's the inherent issue, that we don't, as people, operate very well if we know the future. We are created in a way in which not knowing the future is, in a sense, essential to the manner in which we normally comport ourselves. So, ever in your living, remember you're dying. Memento mori is very important. Living as if this is the last moment is not just a theological concept. It is actually a truthful way in which most people have to think of their lives, because it is true that it could be that in 2 minutes 2 jumbo jets will crash over this building and engulf us all. We live our lives knowing that, but also having to know it's not going to happen. Otherwise we wouldn't do anything. So we've always got this problem about knowing the future. Now, the difficulty with climate change is that we know the future. Insofar as it is possible, because nothing is certain in this life, we know that if we go on like we're going on, the world will become uninhabitable. All we don't know is how quickly or in what precise way. Is it because the ocean system totally changes? Is it because that very thin veneer called the atmosphere, which you will remember is the same in, if you look at it in a simple form, the globes that we all have seen, maybe have, are covered because they have to be in varnish. The thickness of that varnish is proportionately the same as the thickness of the planet's atmosphere. It's a very small thing which keeps the temperature on this planet within the necessary parameters to keep life as we know it. So there isn't much doubt about the fragility of this planet, and we don't know which of those fragile elements might be the finally be the thing that upsets our ability to live here. But we do know that going on like this will sooner or later, or I think increasingly we think sooner or very sooner, will make this place uninhabitable. Now I know that it is not popular to say that, because they say if you frighten people too much, then they will say let's eat, drink and be merry because tomorrow we're going to die anyway. But we are not talking to ordinary people who think like that, to a whole series of intelligent people who know perfectly well it's best to know the truth. And the truth is that we are very close to a kind of Armageddon. That is the truth. And what is more, we increasingly know that to be the truth. And interestingly, human beings then react in a number of ways. The best way is to pretend it isn't true. Either to pretend it is true, but I'm not going to take any account of it, which is what most people do, or to say it can't be true, there must be some reason or another why it isn't true. And then we have the tobacco scientists who provide some mechanism by which people are able to claim that they don't need to deal with it because it's all got up by people who want research grants. And the third mechanism of dealing with it is what I would call the Bush method, which is to say, God is very good, and God will make sure that when the time comes, there will be some wheeze of science which will solve the problem. And it's quite wrong not to trust God. This is a religious approach which I find difficult. But it is certainly a religious approach much loved in the United States. There are many, indeed, who go further than that. As you know, it's more than half those polled in the United States believe that the end of the world is nigh, and that it will come about in much the same way as the book of Revelation paints. Now, I'm not one of those who takes a liberal view of religion. I'm certainly a traditionalist. But I'm not at all sure that they shouldn't remember those words of scriptures which say it is not for you to know the times and seasons that the Lord hath ordained. And that's our problem, is that we're beginning to know the signs of seasons, not that the Lord hath ordained, but that we may be bringing upon ourselves. That makes life very difficult. And it seems to me that there is a real issue here about how institutions deal with what is itself a non-analogous situation. When they say this is the first time that we've had the earth warming up so fast and so much, therefore we are in a non-analogous world. We're also in a non-analogous world in the sense that we now know something which tells us that we could avoid disaster, but only if we do a series of things very rapidly. And the third thing that it tells us is that we can only avoid disaster if we all do a series of things very rapidly. Which brings another aspect into this which makes it so difficult for Parliament to handle it. Mr. Bush, of course, says we'll do things about climate change when India and China do things about climate change, missing the very important philosophic and moral point that those who have made the mess ought to clean it up. Not a very deep philosophic point, and one which my mother would have told me very easily after I'd spilt the milk on the carpet. And so the idea that those who haven't benefited from pollution should do their bit first before we who've made riches out of that pollution do anything seems to me to be manifest nonsense. But Mr. Bush believes it, but then that is a characteristic of most of his beliefs. Now, the issue is, therefore, how do we deal with this non-analogous position? Here is a scientific advance which tells us a truth about the future which demands action. Lots of times science have told us the truth about the future which didn't demand action, but this is a truth which demands action. And it not only demands action, but it demands a kind of action which man's institutions are peculiarly ill-designed to handle. First of all, it demands immediate action. Well, that we know, as it's going to be the responsibility of a bureaucracy, is itself not easy. Secondly, it demands universal action on a national basis, in the sense that we're all in this together. So whatever we do in Britain, all of us have to do it. So there's an issue of social justice here which is peculiarly difficult to handle. You cannot solve the problems of climate change if anybody is excluded. But you can't have a system whereby those who are most able to contribute don't do more than those who are least able. So there is a social justice element here, because people are not going to work together for an end if they feel it's unfair. Let me give you a practical example of that. I'm the chairman of a water company. We have the least happy water situation in Britain, in the sense that Folkestone and Dover, which is one of our constituent members, has a water supply which is entirely from an aquifer which is fading fast. So we are the first and so far the only company in the country to be given a special status of permanent drought, which means that we can have compulsory water metering. Now, we've already got voluntary water metering for about 64% of our customers. I have said I am not prepared to have compulsory water metering unless we have a socially just tariff. So we are inventing a socially just tariff based upon the principle that people will have a standard tariff which provides enough water for a family of parents and 2 children. They'll be able to ask for more at that rate if they have more than 2 children. Otherwise, once you get above that level, the price will rise very sharply, much faster than the actual price, but that's because the rich and the profligate are going to have to pay the cost necessary for the poor and those who are needy. That's, roughly speaking, what we shall do. But, of course, that is not legal in this country, because the law was established at a point in which you had, in general, pretty low water prices that you knew were going to rise, because that's why you privatised, because you hadn't done the investment that you ought to have done, and this was the only way of getting the investment that you needed to do. And that investment was going to cost money, but that you were therefore going to put a regulatory system designed to make sure that no one took advantage of their monopolistic position, because you can't have 2 water companies providing this water at the same house. So you have got those people in your hand. So let's keep them under control, said the then government, and the next government took even tougher views. That means, of course, that the one thing we're not supposed to do is to cross-subsidise anyone. And you can't cross-subsidise people on the basis of their income either. Well, we're producing it, and I think I've got the regulator to accept that as long as we use the right words, he is going to try to interpret it so we can do it. But that's only the first of what's going to be a real issue. How can you be sufficiently just in a society to make people feel that we're all in it together when you have a real threat akin to invasion or war? But of course it's also a longer term threat. That's the second part of this. It is not something which we can solve within a parliament. So although you may have to have the controversy to keep people up to the mark, you need to accept these policies, having been decided, must continue, probably forever, but certainly for 50 years. We've got no human institutions that can operate that. We've no idea how to do it. So Parliament is faced with a fundamental problem, that not only has it got to learn about social justice in a way in which it has not thought about it before, but it's also got to learn about how you create decisions which can stand the test of time. Now, for those who come from other countries, I ought to repeat here that one of the things about the parliamentary system is that it is absolutely axiomatic that no parliament can bind its successor. So anything you do before an election cannot be enforced on the parliament that is elected thereafter. We have no mechanism. Now, some people have that because they have gone through war and revolution, and they have written constitutions in which you can actually tie people to particular forms and perhaps build in a referendum or some percentage of votes that they have to get in Parliament before they can change it. But we in Britain can't do that. We have no mechanism of doing that, and it is a much cherished belief. But there is a last element which makes this so difficult to handle. It is that Britain's contribution to the world's emissions is about 3%. America, with 4% of the world's population, has 25% of the emissions. Britain, with a significantly smaller proportion, of course, has 3%. So it's very easy for people to take the other way out, which is, of course I believe it, of course I would do something about it, but what's the point in doing something about it when anything I do this year will be taken up by China? So there's no point. It will make no difference. And therefore, why should I put myself at a disadvantage to the rest of the world? All right, it may be that we all collapse, but even if I did do what was right, it won't make any difference. And so, you have to accept that there is a global dimension here which is also hugely difficult for a parliament to handle. Naturally, because national sovereignty means that it has no control over other parliaments. And naturally, too, because it has an interest in its own nation, which goes far beyond its interest in any other nation, simply because it is elected by its own nation. And therefore, it has to say to itself, we have got to face down those who would say 3% of the world's emissions it's not worth worrying about. And we've got to find ways of doing that. But chief amongst them is to show that we are beginning to create a global structure which makes it possible for the world to face what is a world problem. That brings us back, of course, to the issue of social justice. If anybody thinks that China or India is likely to play its part in a global structure, for example, of compulsory carbon trading, which is a necessary part of any future development, if they feel that the system is being manipulated so they are paying a price to keep the rich part of the world in the state it has become accustomed to, then they've got another thing coming. There is no way that there can be a global answer to these problems unless there is a degree of global justice. I don't mean equality, I mean simply justice. And that means, of course, that whatever mechanisms that you build, they have to be mechanisms in which the rich pay for the poor. This is not a popular activity among rich people, and many poor people don't get the money even when they have paid, so that isn't good either. And in the middle of that, of course, is a very difficult issue for Western democracies, and indeed for advanced nations throughout the world. This is the end of imperialism. There is no doubt in my mind that what climate change says is that you cannot think of anyone else in the same way as mankind has thought about its neighbours down through history. Imperialism is not something invented in the 19th century. Imperialism is the state of mankind. Right back as far as we know, one tribe has sought to dominate the neighbour. Wherever we look down in history, there are battles for hegemony. That is the nature of human society. It has been right the way down the ages. For the first time, we are not going to solve this problem, which threatens us all, unless we share the problem and the solution in a way which demands a respect for each other, which is pretty difficult to imagine. Because after all, in this post-imperial world, it is not true that every nation has been equal. The World Trade Organization, the International Bank, the Monetary Fund, the international institutions have all been based upon the principle that the rich and powerful nations know about these things, and they are going to set down the rules under which everything operates. And that has been perfectly possible because in the end the poor and in developing nations have seen that if they're going to get the benefits, this is part of the deal. So, of course, people have always been very nice and polite, and they've been called for exactly the same amount of time in the United Nations, but when you go to one of these conferences, you know precisely who's making the decisions. I represented the European Union as the president, as it happened to be the British turn, at the meeting and the World Trade Organization, which was held in Belgium, in the Heisen. And there were, I think, 140 represented nations, and there was a large hall, and in that hall each of the nations gave their views on the what was then the Uruguay round. And in the hall were 4 people. There was the person which led the spokesman to the podium. There was the spokesman who had just finished and hadn't yet got out of the meeting. And there was the spokesman who was going to follow the one that was going up to speak. And that was it. The discussions were going on between the Americans, who had flown an entire building in, the European Union, i.e. me, and my little group, because we would go back and discuss amongst ourselves what we were going to do, and the Japanese, and a representative of the heterogeneous group of nations from Australia and Canada and others, the group that was concerned to have much free trade as possible because they, like Brazil as another member of them, wanted to press for this. The decisions in the end were made between the European Union and the United States. That's who makes the decision, because they are the players, the 2 greatest markets in the world. The European Union, the world's largest trading community, the United States, the second. And if I may say a little internal thing, it's one of those insights which explains why, whatever anyone votes in an election, voting UKIP is manifestly potty and clearly out with any sane view of the world. Because either you want to be part of world decisions or you don't want to be part of world decisions. And if you don't want to be part of world decisions, don't complain about the decisions other people make about you. It's much better to be a part and get a bit of it than not part of it and get none of it, in my view. But still, this is a statement now about how the world is not going to be as far as climate change is concerned. Because it won't be a deal between the European Union and the United States, except in the sense of how we're going to make a juster world, how we're going to tie carbon reduction into enabling poorer people to be able themselves to grow in a cleaner way. I mean, there's a lot of that we're going to have to discuss. But our attitude towards Togo has got to be a lot more respectful than it has ever been up to now. Now, the reason I've gone through all those things is I think you will see what I mean about the fact that this question is much more fundamental than the question appears to be. It is really that the latest in scientific advance demands of a parliamentary system a wholesale change. And it is in attempting to make that change that we are beginning pathetically slowly to recognise that we have to find mechanisms which are simply different if we're going to be able to handle the ethical controversy in any sensible way. And not to go into the details, but just to point out this is the reason why the opposition parties have sought to find a way in which we could isolate certain subjects and say these would be subject to an agreement, that we would agree on some of the difficult issues and agree that we wouldn't make them electoral arguments. Keep them as parliamentary arguments to keep the government down to it, but that we wouldn't make them electoral arguments because we'd sign up to a joint agreement. Well, that's already run into trouble. We got all the opposition parties but not the government. We thought if we held on then the government would join, but the Liberals have now backed out of it because they want it to be more prescriptive and they want it to include the statement that in no cases would we use nuclear power as a means of dealing with climate change. So we are back more or less where we started from. I have still hopes that we will do. But there is one concept which might make the difference. And I present it to you as my hope. And that is a view which David Cameron has put forward and has got the support of a very large number of cross-party people, which is that we would establish an outside group of experts, largely scientists, who would set the targets for emission reduction which are necessary year by year. And they would then monitor what the government did to achieve those targets and would present to Parliament every year an assessment of how successful in that year we had been to meet the targets for that year. And if we were not successful, to present to Parliament a series of suggestions which they believed might make the difference. This is, as my children would say, a cunning wheeze. It's a cunning wheeze because it enables you to say that it is Parliament and the government that makes the decision as to what you do. But it also makes it clear that it is not Parliament or the government that judges what it does. Nor is it some outside body without democratic control that makes judgments about what is the best way to achieve the end, although they do give public advice. I think this is probably the only way forward. It is a way forward which would be introduced under one government. I think it has a good chance of winning support from this government as well. Although whether they would want it while they were in power is a different issue. So one needs to get it into the programme of the party that is hoping to win so firmly that when it does win, it has to do it, and accept that at that point it would have the opposition very keen on it because that was no longer in power. Now that's using the system to achieve the end, which seems to me to be necessary. So when I said the answer to the question was badly, I think perhaps, having explored it with you, I have to say something even harder. Badly because it is very difficult. Badly not because we are nasty, unpleasant or incompetent, but because what we are now being asked to do has never been asked of anyone ever before. And the context in which we have to do it is itself non-analogous. And in that sense, both the most disturbing sense and, because I'm like that, the most exciting one. Now, in the last 2 or 3 minutes, I want just to say, of course, there are other ethical issues raised by science, which, although none that has got anything of the importance of this, I mean, don't hardly worth talking about almost anything else. But I do want to talk about one thing which I do think is worth talking about. The point at which Parliament is at its most distracted is when science is pointing to an ethical problem. Because Parliament in this country is very bad at ethics. That is again because we have removed ethical issues from party politics. You will note that I take a view of party politics which is rather different from many. Many people assume that party politics is sort of bad, and that if only you could take things out of party politics. You know, you've often heard that about local government. If only take it out of party politics, then it would all be much better. Of course, it's just a misunderstanding of what party politics is. Party politics is a recognition that there isn't one answer to any question. Not in this world, not in the secular world. And that even if there were an answer, somebody would find another one, because that is the nature of human beings. So if you want to have a proper discussion, you have to recognise that. It's no good pretending that it isn't like that. And anybody who's ever lived in a district council run by independents will know exactly what I mean. What you do is to exchange government by party politics for government by bureaucrats. Because in the end, the system takes over. Because you can't operate without creating some kind of structure in which human beings come together to create a consensus of some sort. And in a democracy, it is hard to have a system where that consensus is one consensus. Now, the problem with moral issues in Britain, and any Americans amongst us will recognise the difference, is that anything that is a moral issue is immediately becomes a matter of conscience, is therefore excluded from the party political discussion. And the best example of that is abortion. Abortion in the United States is a matter of intense party political discussion. Very hard to be a Democrat and to be opposed to abortion. I always find that difficult to understand. How is it that a party that doesn't like capital punishment wants as much abortion as possible, where the party that does like capital punishment wants as little abortion as possible? Seems to me a very difficult moral position to be in. I am opposed both to capital punishment and abortion, think I am logical. I think they are both illogical, but there we are. So you do get into a very difficult position when you get to the situation of that sort of ethical position in Britain, because it's non-party political. So again, the structure doesn't work. And if you look, for example, at the David Steel Abortion Act, it was only passed when the then Labour government turned it into a party political issue by giving the private member's bill government time, so that the efforts of those who believed this to be wrong could not win. That's what they did. So we come back to the same sort of example, that when Parliament has to deal with an ethical issue, in the end it can only do so if it manages to cramp it and push it like a Procrustean bed into the system. Because if it doesn't do that, it never deals with it at all. We never really dealt with abortion. It just meant that people like me who were opposed to it could usually find a parliamentary mechanism for stopping it going through. I don't happen to think that hunting is a moral issue, as a matter of fact. Indeed, I think those who think it's a moral issue are incredibly confused. It is perfectly possible to say that you don't like hunting, and I suppose it's perfectly possible to say that if you don't like hunting, then you are going to stop other people hunting. That is a perfectly possible position. I think it's pretty difficult to say that it is a moral issue. And of course, Parliament didn't treat it as a moral issue. It was a government bill. It was a private member's bill in which the government gave the support and a minister and time to debate and a guillotine. That's what it was. And that's why it got through. not because Parliament was dealing with a moral issue. Why? Because there are enough people in Parliament to make sure it wouldn't get through if it were on the basis of not government time and government whipping. So I do think one has to recognise that the issue for Parliament dealing with ethics is extremely fraught. And as I don't like finishing a speech without a controversial note, I want to suggest something worse than that. I think we have a parliamentary system which ensures an immoral response. Because it is always true that the latitudinarian at best and the unconcerned at worst have a majority. You never get majorities for the great facts of the faith, because it's inconvenient, because there are lots of people in your constituency who won't like it, because you don't feel very strongly about it yourself. So don't go to the scaffold on that. We'll always find a way around that. And as a result, Parliament is a means whereby those who are lukewarm always win. And those who care passionately on one side or the other always lose, except when people make it a non-party political matter. Because then Parliament doesn't give them the time, and you can usually find a way of stopping it. But the truth is, we have moved a long way away from that. And we are now in a society where it is increasingly true that those of us who hold views other than the view of the fashionable elite lose, because the system is designed now in a way which it wasn't before. And the changes made in our mechanisms and the ways in which we control the time of Parliament do mean that it will be very hard to stop, for example, euthanasia. You only have to have a couple of really unpleasant cases portrayed in the papers as terrible situations where mercy killing is obviously the humanistic answer, to find that we'll lose. Only reason we haven't lost so far is because the government has made an assessment that it is politically disadvantageous. The moment they thought it was politically advantageous, we would lose. People like me would yet again be portrayed as reactionary, and those who oppose us will be portrayed as progressive. The fact that they share this view with Herr Hitler is, of course, not a thing you can properly say in this world, which is why I said it in this university. And as I am not as famous as the Pope, I will not be burnt in effigy. But I do think our parliamentary system is ill-fitted to handle the great issue of climate change, and equally ill-fitted to handle the great issues of morality which scientific advance place before us. The fact that it's also true that few politicians understand the science, and even fewer understand the ethical issues involved, makes it a pretty disappointing situation.
Thank you very much indeed for giving us off to a fascinating start to our whole weekend. If perhaps a somewhat depressing one. But let's have some questions for Mr. Gunn.
Well, can I start?
Yeah.
I was thinking about the problem of trying to bring about bipartisan agreement over climate change, which you analysed so carefully, and I enjoyed your talk so much. And you talked about the difficulty of persuading in a democracy that we have to act against our own interests, because governments get elected by offering things that advantage those who vote for them. So there's the problem of how to picture the threat. And I grew up during the Second World War, and the threat was very real. And I can remember 1940, and expecting German invasion. So it was very easy to bring about national homogeneity. But this is something which it seems to so many people so far off in the future. And usually what happens in these situations is we get to the edge of the precipice and we realize that we're in trouble and we draw back. With climate change, there is no drawing back, because the damage, by the time the United States realizes that it's going to have to control its carbon emissions, the damage will have been done irreversibly. And it's this lag period before before public understanding becomes the majority that I see no solution to, and I wonder if you had any comments.
Well, it is true what you say, I'm not suggesting that it's an easy thing. I think it is easier than you portray it in this sense. I am positive enough to believe that there has been a huge change in public opinion all over the world, actually, and certainly in this country over the past 9 months, leave alone the last 3 years. When I first started to talk about climate change, they thought that it was another of those things that a pro-European Catholic would be saying. You know, it was, he's got these views and he's all right in the other things, but that's what they thought. It was a slightly potty kind of concept, really. All I know now is that people are treating one slightly as a guru because you were there before. It's rather embarrassing, it makes you feel very old, but that is the truth. So the change has happened, and you could not conceive of the kind of discussions which we are having, for example, in the Conservative Party now about the sort of policies that we are going to present at the next election. They are wholly different from anything I've ever thought I could be party to. And I'm quite sure that Mr. Brown, who is a late convert to this, but has discovered what the public opinion polls underneath are saying about this as an issue, is not going to be laggardly. He'll have some different pictures and mixes, but he will be. And this is one area where it may be that the Liberals are also abused. Therefore, the whole of the structure is likely to deliver, it seems to me, the possibility of us, and there will be other countries too, which have already done well, Denmark, Austria, the Netherlands. The Netherlands got internal problems of a different kind, which make it more difficult for it to be in advance, but there will be. And it seems to me that the more we are able to show that this can be done without making people's lives thoroughly miserable, and not destroying the economy, but indeed being fillip to the economy, the more others will be able to get onto the bandwagon. And in this, I do have to say one thing. And it is that one of the problems is that we have to handle the green movement. And the green movement is really very dangerous, because having been the organisations who've actually got us all here, they do have a natural puritanism and a hair-shirtedness which is extremely unpleasant. Now, if praise God bare bones was the only way in which religion could be understood, I'd be an atheist, because I wouldn't want to believe in a God like his God. And if that God did exist, and he were right, I'd prefer to live life in ignorance of such a God, because I clearly wasn't going to come to any terms with him. Now, that's the trouble with the Greens. they so often say, well, it'll be good for you not to travel in a motor car and ride a bicycle and go out in the rain and not have a hot road, all that. It's nonsense. You're not going to win that way. The Puritans in the end never win. It is only those who recognise the joyous fact that so many of these things are God-given, that this life is good, and it is, you aren't better from being miserable. Indeed, there are some awful pictures in that hall of superior persons in the Congregational Presbyterian churches whom I'm sure were extremely good, but they do look very miserable, and I don't like misery. The church is not about misery. So our problem is that most people out there think that all these things are going to cost them a lot.
Yes.
Now, some of the big things we can do don't cost them anything. I'm not suggesting there aren't some things we're going to have to give up, you know, I'm not suggesting that. But, for example, we've got to rebuild almost all our power stations about 2010, in that sort of area. If we bring all the new ones, even if we make no technological changes except use the best technology around for gas and coal, and we move those power stations into the centre of town so we can use the heat that they produce, we will move their efficiency up from 40% to 90%. Now you could look at that another way and say that halves the emissions. If we actually used the efficiency which modern but technology we've already got on all our white goods, our motor cars, within 5 years we'd have halved the emissions of all of those, because the best in every case is twice as good as the worst. Now, it doesn't mean to say people won't be driving cars, and it doesn't mean to say people won't be washing up in dishwashers, but it does mean that they will be half as damaging to the climate. Now, of course, that's not enough. Of course, that's only a beginning. But if people saw that you could do all that without them feeling, I've got to go back to the Stone Age, then Mr. Bush would be less attractive. And that I'm bent upon achieving.
It was starting to get less depressing, wasn't it? More questions there.
Can I ask you to think broadly? You said you like thinking broadly. We've currently got about 0.7 degrees C increase, and predictions are 3 to 6 degrees, probably depending how we react. Now, that's more than the human race has seen, as far as I know. But it's not more than the Earth has seen. The Earth has had 10-degree changes in about the same rapidity in the past, and it's coped with it perfectly well. It's just, you know, you can grow crops in Siberia, and other places are less pleasant to live. So my question is that a big part of the problem to reacting might be that people are tied to land, and wars are always over land. We have our little borders, and we want that bit, so we fight them for it. If the world were such, or it could be made to such, that populations could move, then the actual temperature change is not a huge issue. And what's your response to that? Because that's a political question, well, a political and social question, really.
Well, I don't want to have a scientific argument, but I don't actually think that the argument, and you're probably much so wonderfully academically qualified that I wouldn't dare enter the argument, but as I understand it, let me put it this, I don't think that is a proper fact. I mean, I think that the fact is that the speed and amount of temperature change is not something that we've seen for 400,000 years, and what's more, it has a continuum, which if we don't interrupt it, is something which is manifestly way beyond anything we've experienced before. So
no, that's true, that's what I said. The human race has never seen
yes,
that
well
before.
now, if that's the case, and we're talking 400,000 years, if that's the case, the thing that must concern us is that we don't know whether some of those changes are things which actually wouldn't result in so neat a conclusion that we could move to different places and the rest of it. So I just want to make that caveat. I mean, I don't think I really believe the hypothesis is one which is likely. But if it were, because that's only fair, and I am a politician, therefore one should always answer hypothetical questions, contrary to the normal rule, I think there are degrees of difficulty. And I think it is, frankly, jolly difficult to get people to live in a carbon-less intense way, but but that's a darn sight less difficult than conceiving of people moving around like nomads into places they've never been, when there are 9 billion of you, soon to be 12 billion. I mean, you know, this is a hell of a lot of people to be moving about. And one of the problems anyway that we're saying about is that what climate change is going to cause is the large movement of people. And that's one of the things that is likely to make President Bush change his mind. I mean, there's likely to be a very significant change in the United States round about the State of the Union message next January, because all the messages they're trying to put out is that it won't, of course, be that he believes in climate change. It will be that it's all about energy security and about all sorts of other things. But it does mean, I think, that there is a major change move in that area. And one of the things that is frightening the Americans very strongly is their sudden realization that you have a lot of people moving about, a lot of refugees and people. They're not going to be able to opt out of it. Iraq has had a real effect on them, recognizing that at the one side they're not able to handle the world in the imperialist way that they thought they could. But it's also brought home to them they can't opt out of the world either, which is also a very difficult thing. And I think this is what's going to make the difference. But I think the idea of herding people round the planet is more difficult than the very difficult task you set me there.
Thank you. More questions? Yes, at the back.
In my lab we have a sort of informal coffee club made of biologists, environmental scientists, etc., and we sort of sit around and chew the cud on these sort of issues. And whenever we talk about climate change or anything like this, the conclusion of the conversation always goes, oh, but whatever will never happen because the oil companies have too much say over what government does. Is that actually the case?
Well, no, actually the oil companies, or the best of them, are amongst those who are most clear about why we should change. They, if you take BP or Shell, but particularly BP, is very clearly in its mind. It sees itself as an energy company, and that it thinks that it doesn't much matter what the energy that it provides is. Its job is to provide energy. And that's why it's spending significant sums of money in trying to find alternatives. What it says is, of course, that in the meantime we are a carbon-based economy, and what you ought to be doing is reducing the amount of carbon that you use to achieve any given end. I really don't find the oil companies in this country, and some of the better ones, of that kind. I think once again we come back to which ones. Exxon is exactly the opposite. Halliburton is exactly the opposite. I mean, they have decided that climate change denial is their line. I never buy Exxon petrol. I hope nobody here does. I think it's unacceptable for them to use my money to campaign about something which is entirely untrue. And it's the only company that's ever threatened me, which they did. And you just have to accept it. There are some very nasty people in the world, and some of them work for Exxon, and it really is a company which needs to it shouldn't be that, given that they spend money in order to promote a view in the same way as certain tobacco companies promoted a view. And the view that they promote is to cause doubt. The technique is, let's cause doubt. Because people won't do things while they're not quite sure. Particularly because it's easier, just easier, to cause doubt. And to say, well, if it's not quite sure, it's an awfully big thing to do, and, you know, it might be too much. And then you know, there you've got a story for Norman Lamont. You know, that's what happens.
But moving beyond the actual companies, what about entire countries whose economies rely on oil? How much is that a political push?
Well, that is perfectly true. I mean, you have to recognise that countries that rely on oil in the sense they've got nothing else, the Middle Eastern countries, will find this whole operation very difficult. But then we're going to have to pay them. We're going to have to buy them out. That's the only answer. The difficulty with buying them out is that the people you buy out are not the people you want to buy out. You know, I'm not sure that I want to buy out 1,000 members of the Saudi royal family. But the real truth is that the only way you're going to have to pay the cost of carbon reduction in a way which makes it possible for people to accept it. Now, in fact, it will be possible, because if we were to halve our emissions by halving the amount of energy we were using, partly by using it more efficiently and partly by energy saving, two different ways of doing it. I think a sensible government producing oil would reduce the amount of oil which they produced, extend the life of the oil, find ways of which they got a proper return for what they did sell. All that becomes more clear. And after all, these are countries which are getting $65 a barrel when they were getting $12 a barrel. Well, somewhere between that's possible, isn't it?
Thank you. Yes.
Do you see a fundamental change in attitude to nuclear power?
Yes, I think it's very true that whereas nuclear power was not on the tapis at all 4 years ago, it now clearly is in the frame. I referred to the problem we've had with the Liberals on this issue. I think I can speak independently of this because I've got 2 nuclear power stations in my constituency. I'm not opposed to nuclear power. I don't actually think that nuclear power does have a very big part to play in this whole future for a number of quite different reasons. First of all, it seems to me that if we're going to solve this problem, we have to do it in the most cost-effective way. In other words, this is going to be very expensive, and you must make sure that you don't spend money which you don't need to spend. Now, there is no way in which nuclear power can contribute in any significant manner to what we want to do before about 2025.
Because we've already wound it down.
Well, partly because of that, and partly because of the actual ability and time and cost and all the rest of it, and acceptance will take that time. Secondly, if you look at the contribution which substituting nuclear power to the degree which even the most enthusiastic nuclear power producers are, it is proportionately, significantly smaller than what you can do with energy saving and energy reduction rest. And therefore I have a worry about nuclear power because people think it's a silver bullet. I mean, a lot of those people who've never been prepared to face up to climate change are now saying, well, I now believe it, so let's go to nuclear power. Now, you can't operate like that because the figures don't make them. There are 2 other reasons that I just want to put to you, which is a real problem about nuclear power. I think in this new interdependent world that we're all trying to build and have to build for the solutions of which I speak, I think we get ourselves in a terribly difficult position over nuclear power, because if you ask me honestly what my view is, it is I think nuclear power is very safe if it's incisable in my constituency in a democratic country with a transparent society. I don't want the Kyrgyz in Kyrgyzstan to have it, and I don't want them because I think they're not safe with it. And the second thing is this: one of the reasons that we're much helped at the moment is that people recognise that energy security is crucial, that we really can't have a future entirely dependent upon some of the most unstable and some of the least nice of countries. So of course we talk about energy security. If you go for a major amount of nuclear power, you are putting yourself into the hands of every other nuclear power user. Because one accident anywhere, and the Daily Mail will cease to be pro-nuclear power and become anti-nuclear power, and if there's a nuclear power station in the course of building in my constituency, it will be stopped. I mean, you know, you have to face the political issues of this. The only reason that Chernobyl didn't do that in Britain was simply because we weren't building any nuclear power stations at the time, and because we could pat ourselves on the back and say, well, they're the Russians anyway, so they'll get it wrong. You know, I mean, that, roughly speaking, was how we explained it away. Couldn't do that again. Another nuclear power accident of the size of Chernobyl would, in fact, in my view, cripple the industry universally. So you are putting yourself in the safety hands of people who you wouldn't do it on any other basis. So I have a real one. Therefore, I've always said, we build them if private enterprise, in market terms, on fair deal, are prepared to put the money. And I've don't think that I shall see a Sizewell C built in my lifetime. Because in the end, nuclear power always costs significantly more than they claim it will cost, and in the end, there are better ways of using the money, and I don't think we'll get it. In directed economies like France you will, but you won't here, I think. But that's not because I take a principled opposition to it, it's because I think it just won't happen.